joining. We'll start in 2 minutes, 9:33. Okay, let's start. Good morning, everyone. You have successfully joined the CPUC Integrated Resource Planning Modeling Advisory Group webinar. I'm Eshraghi, an analyst on the Energy Division's Integrated Resource Planning team. I'm joined by my colleagues, comprising fellow CPUC staff and CPUC consultants from E3. Let's have a quick panelist introduction. IRP team, David and Nathan.
Sure. Nathan Barcic, Supervisor, IRP.
David Withrow, a senior analyst on the IRP team.
Energy Resource Modeling team, Donald and Patrick.
Hi, this is Patrick Young on the Energy Resource Modeling team.
And this is Donald Brooks, also from the Energy Resource Modeling team.
And in 3, Jimmy and Xiaoxuan.
Hello, this is Jimmy Nelson. I'm a managing consultant at E3, and I work on resolve modeling and IRP for the CPUC.
Hi, my name is Xiaoxuan Hou. I'm a consultant at E3, working on resolve modeling and supporting the IRP process for CPUC.
Thank you. Next slide. So this MAG webinar is focused on IRP model improvements and the results of comparing actual and model GHG emissions and dispatch. We'll start with the introduction. I'll introduce the topic and then hand it to the CPUC Energy Resource Modeling team to describe recent and planned updates to SERVM model. And then for the agenda item 3 and 4, CPUC consultants from E3 will present a comparison between actual CAISO 2019 GHG emissions and model 2020 emissions in the Resolve and SERVM, as well as a SERVM dispatch data study. Also, as we noted here, we will have Q&A at each section. Next. Let's start with the introduction. Next slide. This webinar is being recorded as was stated in my email to the IRP service list. The recording will be posted on the IRP events and materials webpage in a few business days. Also, slides that we are presenting are available now on the same page. Just as a note, we made some small changes to the slides that we are presenting compared to the one that we have uploaded on the IRP page. The updated slides will be also available along with the recording. Next slide. As I mentioned earlier, we have allowed some time for questions and feedback at each section. We will do those verbally as opposed to through the WebEx chat function. So please don't use chat function for like technical questions regarding the materials of this MAG and presentation. In the meantime, you are all on mute. If you are experiencing technical difficulties, my colleague David and myself will be monitoring the chat function during the webinar. To ask a question, please raise your hand by clicking the hand icon next to your name. This is visible by accessing the participants list by clicking that icon at the bottom of your screen. Our webinar host, David, will then unmute your microphone and you can proceed to ask your question. Please state your name and affiliation when doing so, and please remember to lower your hand afterwards by clicking that same icon. Also, for those with the phone access only, dial *3 to raise your hand. Once you have raised your hand, you'll hear the prompt, you have raised your hand to ask a question. Please wait to speak until the host calls on you. Then we can unmute your microphone and you can proceed to ask your question. Also, again, just to remember, dial *3 again at the end to lower your hand. Thank you. Just a quick background for those not familiar with the IRP Modeling Advisory Group. To support the IRP proceeding, the MAG provides an open forum for informal discussion of data resources, assumptions, and modeling activities undertaken by CPUC staff. Participation is open to the public, subject to the terms of charter. As you can see, the link to the charter has been provided in this slide. Stakeholders' feedback during and following the MAG informs staff work products, which later introduced into the formal record of IRP proceeding. Next slide. Now a bit background about the topic of today's webinar. As most of you are familiar with the IRP modeling process, CPUC uses the resolve capacity expansion model to design portfolios of new resources expected to meet electric system planning goals at least cost. Resolve simulates hourly dispatch of resources to meet electric demand and reports annual GHG emissions as part of its portfolio optimization. Also, CPUC uses SERVM probabilistic reliability and production cost model as a separate tool, more specifically designed to examine system reliability once an optimal portfolio has been determined by Resolve. The 2020 adopted reference system portfolio modeling showed that the SERVM's 2030 CAISO emissions were about 3.5 MMT higher than Resolve's. The adopted decision also—
Hey, Ali, it looks like you're off one slide.
Oh, sorry, next slide. Just the background. One slide back. Yes, thank you.
I think you didn't cover the purpose of the webinar. You need to go back to the purpose.
I'm covering that, yeah.
Oh.
If we can go back one slide. Just one slide ahead. Next slide. Yeah, here. So the adopted decision also noted that similar to the last IRP cycle, staff would compare actual CAISO reported emissions with modeled emissions in a continuing effort to ensure alignment between models and reliability. This topic is particularly important for IRP because, as I described, Resolve and SERVM are our planning tools for meeting our 2030 GHG reduction. So we want to make sure that first, these two models are aligned with each other as closely as possible, and our accounting is also closely aligned to actual emissions as possible. In this webinar, Energy Division and E3 staff will inform the stakeholders about recent IRP model improvements and the results of comparing actual and model GHG emissions and dispatch, and invite feedback. This includes recent and planned updates to SERVM model and inputs to prepare for evaluating system reliability and emissions of aggregated LSC IRP portfolios. Reliability and operational modeling results with completed improvements and updated comparison to Resolve, dispatch, and emissions. Comparison between actual CAISO 2019 GHG emissions and model 2020 emissions in Resolve and SERVM. And finally, a deep dive on SERVM dispatch patterns to assess realism and expected behavior under present and future grid conditions. Next slide. So based on what I've described, the scope of the webinar is SERVM model improvement, comparison between IRP model emissions and actual CAISO reported emissions, and comparing SERVM hourly dispatch with CAISO hourly settlement. So Also, as an important clarifying note and to prevent any confusion, just to prevent any confusion, these results are not updated with the new IPER, and none of the results we are showing here correspond to the new TPP case results. Also, very quickly on out-of-scope items, if to list all of them, that would have been a long list. This webinar is just focused on what I have described, IRP model improvement and GHG ground truthing. So we appreciate if we keep the conversation during the Q&A sections on this topic. Next slide. So we already covered this slide. So I think with that, we can go to the Q&A part of this section. If there is any questions regarding the logistics of, or generally about the topic of today's MAG, we can focus on those questions at this part.
There are no hands raised for questions.
Sounds good. So if there is no question, I think with that, we can move on to the next section and hand it to Erm.
Thank you, Ali. This is Patrick Young with the Energy Resource Modeling section. Today, I'm going to describe some updates to the SERVM model and then present updated results comparison between SERVM and Resolve. Next slide. We completed 2 updates to SERVM over the past few months. First, we rebuilt the wind shapes that are used by the SERVM model. The original wind shapes were based on National Climate Data Center wind speed data, and that data set had some bad or incomplete data in the Alberta and East Riverside and New Mexico areas. So we switched to using the MERA data set from NASA. You can find out more about the MERA data set at the link you see on the slide here. The MERA data set is based on satellite data and we believe to be more complete. After we rebuilt our wind shapes, 20 weather years worth of wind shapes, we checked that the capacity factor of the wind shapes, and we found that it increased. The other update that we did to SERVM over the past few months is updating the SERVM software itself. There are 3 groups of improvements. First, Astrape Consulting, the designer of the SERVM software. We worked with them to improve the unit commitment logic, which had the effect of making the CCGT a little bit more flexible. The second group of improvements we made was around the storage dispatch logic. And previously, storage was modeled to provide ancillary services generally at its maximum discharge megawatts. With this dispatch logic update, we've now, the current state of charge for storage is caps the ability of the storage to provide ancillary services. The third group of updates to the SERVM software was just the various enhancements to the data inputs and outputs that will make it easier for us to use the SERVM model. Next slide. We also have a number of key updates to SERVM that are in progress. They are not yet complete or tested, but we definitely need to use them before our next major round of analysis with SERVM. So the in-progress updates include building the 2019 IPER demand forecast inputs into SERVM, using the latest burner tip fuel price forecast that we get from the Energy Commission. They posted it this summer. And we are also doing some updates to the baseline generating fleet in SERVM. This includes the removal of a few redundant and erroneous units that were found during the other analysis that E3 will be presenting later in this webinar. That analysis comparing historical and modeled CAISO GHG emissions. One of the outcomes of that was identifying a few redundant and erroneous units in the baseline fleet. Another component of the baseline update that we are in progress on is refreshing the additions and retirements based on the most recent CAISO Master Control Area Generating Capability List and the mothball retirement list. And finally, we'll be taking a look at newly contracted projects under development. These will be identified through analysis of the September 2020 LSE IRP data template and any contracts signed to fulfill the D1911-016 procurement order from earlier this year. If you don't recall, that was the near-term reliability procurement order for 3.3 gigawatts of system capacity. Next slide. So with respect to the completed SERVM updates, we wanted to test those and refresh our comparison of results between SERVM and Resolve. So here's what we did. We started with the inputs and SERVM configuration identical to what was described as final in the IRP reference system plan decision. Then we tested the impact of the two major updates that I described we completed, the wind shapes and the updated SERVM software. We used the adopted 46 MMT and 38 MMT portfolios from the reference system plan decision to do these tests. We looked at 2020 and 2030 for the 46 MMT portfolio, and we also looked at 2030 for the 38 MMT portfolio. And we compared results before and after we executed these updates. One final note on this slide is, I mentioned we had some updates that are in progress. So just wanted to be absolutely clear here that the results I will show the audience shortly does not include the 2019 IFR, and it does not analyze the portfolios being proposed for the upcoming 21-22 CAISO transmission planning process. We will present those results at a later date. Next slide. Before we show results, just wanted to refresh the audience on some definitions of the output metrics from SERVM. So first, the reliability metrics. We've got loss of load expectation, which characterizes the expected frequency of events. Loss of load hours characterizes the expected duration of these events, unserved energy. If expected unserved energy is the expected volume in megawatt hours of unserved energy. We define an event of unserved energy as when operating reserves falls to below 4.5% of hourly demand. This is based on a 3% spinning reserve and a 1.5% regulation requirement percent of hourly load. So if the system is not able to balance and maintain those operating reserves, then that is what is our threshold for saying that a loss of load event has occurred. The electric system in our model, we consider reliable if the probability weighted LOLE, loss of load expectation, is less than or equal to 0.1. And this corresponds to the industry rule of thumb, 1 day in 10 years where firm load must be shed to balance the grid. SERVM also outputs a number of operational metrics. And so we're going to report annual energy by resource type, imports and exports, curtailment, storage, storage dispatch, production costs, and emissions. Next slide, please. Okay, so here are the results. You see a large table with lots of numbers in it. Let's see, so the green columns indicate the original SERVM results associated with the reference system plan before we executed the wind shape and SERVM software update. The pinkish columns indicate the results from our study with the wind shape updates, and then the sort of peach color column indicate the effects of both the wind shape update and the SERVM software update. So I'm going to focus in on the numbers that I've circled in the table. The wind shape update, as I mentioned, had higher capacity factors for wind resources, especially out-of-state wind. And this is easily observed in 2030 when the portfolios in 2030 included significant amounts of out-of-state wind in the portfolio. So this higher wind production from these rebuilt wind shapes contributed to higher reliability, which you can see in the blue circle. The LOLE, LOLH, and EUE metrics all went down. Now, what was the impact of the software change? That I've highlighted with the numbers that are circled in orange. It looks like LOLE increased a bit, but EUE went down. What this means is that events were slightly more frequent or longer in duration, but the magnitude of those events was reduced. We think the increased LOLE may be attributed in part to our improvement in the storage dispatch modeling, where the charge state of storage limited its ability to provide ancillary services. Next slide. So in this slide, this is an even busier table, but this is the complete results for the annual energy balance. The structure of the table is similar to what you just saw. There is an additional set of columns to show the original resolve model results side by side. So I won't spend too much time on this slide, but after this presentation, you can take a look at this table and compare the changes, the refreshed comparison between the dispatch, annual energy dispatch of resolve compared to SERVM and with the SERVM changes. I would like to highlight certain rows from this table, so I will show that on the next slide. So if you could advance the slide, please. Okay, so this is a zoom in on a certain set of rows from the previous table. What we see is evidence of the increased wind production and more CCGT use that I mentioned earlier. So the narrow wind shape update significantly increased annual wind production, which more closely match the amounts that were modeled by Resolve. And this is shown with the numbers circled in blue on the table. And you can see that wind production increased definitively after we updated the wind shapes. Dispatchable gas generation was displaced by this higher wind production, and I highlight that with the numbers shown with the orange circle. You can see that with that increased wind production, CCGT dispatch went down. The SERVM software update also resulted in more flexible CCGT use, as I mentioned, and this is highlighted with the numbers circled in green in the table. You can see that CCGT use went up and peaker use went down with this software update. This effect is more apparent in 2030 with a larger solar and wind fleet to balance around and no coal or steam units left in the CAISO fleet that would interact with CCGT and peaker use to sort of obscure the pattern of observed in 2030. Okay, just a couple more slides here. Next slide, please. And finally, here are the emission results. And there's just one major takeaway from this table is that because of the compound effect of the wind shape update and the dispatch changes in SERVM, we actually align quite well with Resolve now. You can see that for the 2030 numbers, we made a significant the consistency of GHG emissions modeled by Resolve and SERVM. That's the numbers circled in blue in this table. In 2020, the changes actually caused a little bit more divergence in GHG emissions between the two models, but we think that the numbers are still relatively close, and we think it's probably because of the more complex mix of resources that are still online in 2020. For example, the coal and steam units. Okay, last slide. So the conclusion and next steps. The wind shape and SERVM software updates brought dispatch patterns and GHG emissions closer to Resolve. We think these improvements are a significant step forward to prepare the models for the next major round of analyses. And that would be evaluating the aggregate portfolio from all of the LSE IRP filings that were submitted in September of this year. So what are the next steps for Energy Division staff in the modeling work? We are going to conduct LOLE studies to assess the system reliability of the portfolio that will be used, proposed for use in next year's CAISO 2021 transmission planning process. And that will, of course, include the 2019 IPER. We're also going to update the baseline units and complete that work. I described that earlier in this presentation. We are still working on aggregating the LSE filings that were submitted in September. So that work needs to be completed. And once all of that is ready, then we will be ready to conduct LOLE studies of the aggregated portfolio, and that should inform selection of the preferred system plan next year. With that, concluding my presentation, and I'll take any questions.
Just as
Again, if you have any questions, yeah, feel free to raise your hand.
Yeah, please don't put your questions in the Q&A section. Just raise your hand during the Q&A at the end of each section.
Jan Krieger, you are unmuted. Jan, we can't hear you. Jan, you're unmuted, but we can't hear you.
David, let's maybe move on to the next one and note Jan. I guess we haven't ruled out the possibility of a technical difficulty. So let's see if someone else works, and then we can address.
Matt Barmack, you're unmuted.
Yeah, hey, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hey, this is probably not material, but I was just wondering why the load seems to vary a little bit numerically across SERVM cases for the same year.
Could you scroll back to the annual energy results slide, David? This is what you're looking at, Matt?
Yeah. So like starting with the green column for 2030, you know, the green and the orange are pretty close, but then the yellow is lower.
Yeah, they're all really within a very small range of difference. Donald, do you have a quick explanation for why the small variance?
Yeah, load is also the sum of demand modifying shapes that we have in SERVM, as well as the charging that batteries, some of the charging losses especially. And so since charging of storage differed a little bit, it added a small difference to the overall demand.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Thanks for that explanation.
Thank you, Matt.
Thanks, Matt. Maurice, you are unmuted.
Hi there, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great, thank you. My name is Maurice Ayo. I'm with SCE. I had a question regarding the Mera wind shapes. Since SERVM is updating the wind shapes to include these new data sets, will Resolve also include the updated wind shapes? I know this isn't really related to the SERVM work, but ultimately my only concern is that the assumptions and inputs going into the capacity expansion model, as well as the production cost modeling, are the same in order to be able to make a much more easily comparable results between the two models.
Well, what I will say is that the new Mera wind shapes have gotten Resolve and SERVM to be a lot closer. So thinking we just leave Resolve the way it is and know that we just got a lot closer with the SERVM modeling. So we're achieving the goal of getting the results to be way closer. I think that's the original. So Resolve, as you know, is 37 days, which means it's not necessarily built with the same shapes and the same way that we create wind shapes as was done when we did the full production cost 8760 model. And so the data, so I think it's just sufficient to say that our results are more similar now. And I think we're getting at the goal of calibrating and making things come out the same between the two models that we run. Does that answer your question?
It does. I'll have to think about that and see if there's other implications. Thank you.
Maurice,
Thank you
for that. This is Nathan Barcic from IRP2. Donald, thanks for your answer. Maurice, it sounds like you might already be kind of considering this, but next time we get around to inputs and assumptions development for our next reference system plan for next cycle, that's when that question would become really important. So we'd welcome recommendations, particularly considering that kind of discrepancy between the 37 days and 8760. We're all ears, but thank you.
Thanks, Maurice. Paul Neslin, you're unmuted. Paul Neslin? Can't hear you. Sorry, I'll try to come back to you. Rebecca Simmons.
Hi, yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, this is Rebecca Simonson with Sonoma Clean Power, and I was just wondering if you could briefly go over again the improvements you made to the storage dispatch.
Yeah, the storage dispatch previously provided ancillary services generally at its maximum discharge capacity when we know that storage can't really do that. So the improvement was that we tracked the hourly state of charge for storage and limited its provision of ancillary services to that. So that constrained the ability of storage to provide ancillary services, and that subsequently led to a little bit increase in the LOLE metric.
Great, thank you.
Brian Beering, you're unmuted. Sorry, I saw your chat question, but go ahead and ask now. We hear
Great.
you.
Thanks, Patrick. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay. So this is Brian Beering on behalf of the American Wind Energy Association of California. I wanted to just follow on the discussion with Edison and Nathan and Donald around just the implications for other aspects of the IRP process. So in particular, Resolve and then the Clean System Power Calculator. And I was a little concerned to hear Nathan's response that, you know, some of these changes in terms of revising Resolve, the 37 days, you know, potentially how the generation profiles are looked at in the context of the Clean System Power Calculator and how those are used to essentially run the preferred system plan and aggregate all the plans that have already been filed. Can you kind of help us understand what the limitations are or why we wouldn't be doing this for the preferred system plan in this cycle?
Brian, I think I see where you're going with that. Correct me if I'm misunderstanding your question, though. This is Nathan. I was answering pretty narrowly in terms of fixes to Resolve. And we don't really see Resolve necessarily playing a role in determining preferred system plan. As you remember from last cycle, preferred system plan is really meant to be an aggregation of all the filings that we got on September 1st. And that's our main goal. If we end up in a place where Resolve is used to make determinations about the composition of the preferred system plan, we can see your point, but I would actually direct you back to Donald's comments before mine, which basically where he basically stated that this represents an improvement in alignment between the two models. And so we're actually in a better place than we were before.
Yeah, I would just go further with that and say if the, well, so now that we've made significant strides in SERVM, in the production cost modeling, and the result is that we're now closer to Resolve, I think we are more confident that Resolve is doing the right thing with regards at least the broad metrics of annual energy and wind generation and that sort of thing. So I think we're now more confident that Resolve is doing the right thing, and we're more confident that SERVM is doing the right thing. And I will add that we are carrying forward, as Patrick was talking about, carrying forward these updates into the transmission planning process modeling and the preferred system plan modeling. So these new wind shapes and the new SERVM software are what we are going to use when we do the modeling for the preferred system plan. So yeah, I hope that got at your question.
Yeah, that's helpful. Thank you, Donald. I guess just one quick follow-up question. I mean, do you think it would affect the new wind, generation profile and the capacity factors from the MERA data? Would that affect the clean system power calculator outputs in terms of how it's looking at the generation profile of candidate resources?
I might be able to provide some insight here. This is Jimmy from E3, and I helped to develop that tool. So, when we were developing that tool, we became aware of this capacity factor inconsistency with wind, and we weren't able, ERM wasn't able to fully fix it in time, but we did choose one specific year for the profiles to simulate and put into that tool. All of the yearly data is based off of 2007. And the reason that year was chosen was because it had a higher capacity factor than normal. So we started off with wind shapes that had a slightly low capacity factor and chose one specific year, which moved us in the right direction. So, if you take a look at the wind capacity factor in that tool, my guess is it's probably closer to either the resolve values or the updated SERVM values versus the unupdated SERVM.
Okay, thanks, Jimmy. Appreciate that explanation.
Thanks, Brian. I'm going to unmute call-in user 19. I think it's Jan Greger. Go ahead.
Okay, let's try again. Can you hear me this time?
Yes.
All right.
Is this Jan?
Yeah, this is Jan Greger from PG&E. Can we go back to slide 16? I think that was the one. Yeah, there we are. So one thing I'm confused about is that in the 2020, oh, my screen just went blank. In the 2020 results, the EUE, if you look going from the pink one to the yellowish one, if you will, EUE went up a little bit from 224 to 244. So it kind of went, in between the green and the red and the pink. But in 2030, it went in the opposite direction. In fact, it dropped by a factor of 2 for both the 46 MMT and the 38 MMT. So I'm wondering why the sort of change in direction with EUE, whereas the LOLE and LOLH maintained the same sort of directionality in that yellow was always higher, between green and pink, if you will.
That's a good question. I don't have an answer for that. I don't think it's that useful to compare these two quite different years. The composition of the fleet in 2020 is quite different from our assumed composition in 2030. 2030 has a lot more renewables and storage in the system, and the dispatch patterns are quite different. There could be any number of factors that is affecting the LOLE and EUE numbers and driving them in different ways that obscure the change that we made where the dispatch of SERVM was improved in the new software, and that change was quite apparent in a fleet like the one we modeled in 2030. And it did not appear very apparent in the fleet that we modeled in 2020. Anyone on the panel have anything to add to that?
Well, this is Donald. I will totally echo what Patrick just said. The change in the fleet is of great significance. A whole lot more batteries, especially, and I think yes, while we don't have the most precise or totally studied answer to this, I am suspecting that it is the contribution of the large quantity of new storage and the changes we made around the way storage behaves, both with producing ancillary services and with needing to pick up maybe smaller events because of the greater flexibility of what the thermal fleet is able to do. That will be my speculation on what the answer might be, though we haven't produced a total, complete answer to it yet.
Okay, I guess my confusion is I would expect, the 2020 results where all three of the reliability metrics sort of point in the same direction. The 2031 seem odd that, LOLE goes up, LOLH goes up, but EUE goes down. Or well, a way to, check in on that and get back to us. I'm not saying it's wrong, it just seems odd to me.
Yeah. Well, I welcome the. Yeah, I think that it makes sense to look more into it and see if we can provide some more answer on that.
And I guess while I have you on the line, just to address Maurice's point earlier about the wind shapes, thank you for updating them. I suspect that not only are things closer to resolve, but they're also closer to actuality. And so PG supports that, and thank you.
Anytime. And well, thank you for any work that you did in highlighting this for us.
Great. Okay. Yeah, now.
Okay, thank you. I count about 4 more hands up, so we could go quickly. Ollie, unless you need to move on, so let me know.
We have 12 minutes, so
okay.
Quickly go through these questions. Yeah.
Chase Wink, I think you're unmuted. Chase? Nope. Christian Lambert.
Hi, this is Christian Lambert with Cal Advocates. Could you go up 1 slide to 15, please? So we have a question about the 4th bullet, which is the definition of loss of load events that are modeled to occur at 3% of demand plus 1.5% regulation requirements. And our question is this a meaningful difference compared to CAISO actuals, which we're hearing from them? They have a 3% of demand reserve requirement, but also an additional 3% for integrated generation. And they're telling us that 6%, which we did see in August, is when they would declare stage 3, and that does not include reg up or reg down.
Well, it's possible, and more conversation with the ISO may illuminate that discussion a little more. If what you're saying is that the ISO is load plus 6% and we're load plus 4.5%, yeah, that may be meaningful. Yeah, likely is meaningful.
Christian, this is Nathan. Thanks for your point, and duly noted. It's definitely something that we're already trying to get to the bottom of. You've probably consumed the root cause analysis that has highlights some similar things. So yeah, we'll be engaged in some serious thought about what is the appropriate number there, and for other things that are part of the PRM construct. But thanks for your input.
This is Patrick. I'll also add for a little bit of background. If you've been following the long-term procurement plan proceeding, which has now evolved into the integrated resource planning proceeding, you may remember that back in around 2015, we had extended stakeholder discussions on the appropriate configuration of various reliability and production cost modeling that were being considered for use to inform the long-term procurement plan work. And as an outcome of that discussion, we did issue some production cost modeling guidance, and we arrived at this assumption here. And this bullet here that states our model treats the threshold of loss of load events at 4.5%. That was one of the things that was specified back then. So we've just carried forward that definition. And if the summer reliability events of this year show that we need to change this assumption because of actual practices that the CAISO is now using to maintain the grid, then we can consider that going forward. And as Donald and Nathan mentioned, we are in discussion with CAISO on that topic.
Thanks, Christian. I'll put you back in mute if you could drop your hand in case you have another question. Ellen Wolf, good morning.
Good morning. It's Ellen Wolf from Zero Consulting. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I had a couple of substantive questions about the wind shape discussion that's happened, and then also a process question. So I raised my hand before the conversation with Brian, and that helped, but I'm still a little bit confused. It sounds like you're pleased, and it seems rightly so, that the SERVM and resolve outputs are tracking better together, but I'm not sure whether you're intending to ultimately include these improved shapes in resolve, or if you're concerned that doing so then might result in the results between resolve and SERVM diverging again for some other reason. I sense a little reluctancy or sense that there was no hurry to include these new load shapes in resolve.
Ellen, this is Nathan. Thanks for the input. And Donald, maybe you and Jimmy can hop in here, but I'll start. So Ellen, I guess perceived lack of urgency is more down to just the next official time we were thinking of updating resolve with anything would have been, in a public sense, would have been for the next cycle's reference system plan, and that we're just kind of generally speaking in a phase of the current IRP cycle where we're more focused on aggregation and basically taking content from LSEs, and a little bit less focused on continuing to kind of update resolve and use it to generate things that might be meaningful this cycle. It's not to say that we don't engage in some mid-cycle improvements. It's possible that still happens. But as it relates to this item, and this is kind of where I think Jimmy's input and Donald's input would help, is that I feel like there is a kind of technical hurdle or at least complicating factor about how well one can kind of map the same shape, like the same source shape, to two models that do two different things and that don't both do 8760s. So Donald, Jimmy, feel free to correct me if I butchered that, but I'll pause there.
Well, I'll just say that that's right. Nobody else jumped in sooner, so I'll just say, yeah, you're right. The resolve model doesn't necessarily, just whatever work went into creating the wind shapes in the resolve model is now justified or validated by having the work done in SERVM come a lot closer to it. That's what I'll say, is that there's no, is that what we've shown is, what we've demonstrated is that the stuff that's in resolve already is now validated by other sources.
Okay, can you hear me now? I was having connectivity issues. Ollie?
Yeah.
Can you hear me? Okay, yeah, so one thing to note also is in the next section, we will at least say, because we did some analysis in the background, that the resolve capacity factors for wind look similar to historical CAISO capacity factors. And so if you think CAISO is aligned to resolve and resolve is aligned to SERVM, then it seems like we mostly have the challenge fixed. The other detail to note is that I think we refer a lot of times to resolves 37 sample days, and there's potentially a worry that the wind capacity factors inside of those days might just, because you're sampling a small subset of days, might not match the historical average. We know of that challenge, and actually we go through a process where we normalize the wind shapes in the 37 days to match the long-run historical capacity factor. So I think, the biggest thing for wind is just how much energy does it generate? And then it is important when it generates, but I think, our main goal is to get the kind of the gigawatt hours of the capacity factor right. And then I think, we also are going to be pretty aligned on when it produces. But yeah, there is a big challenge in trying to sync the data set between the models. That's a pretty big lift. So, I think this is kind of the 80-20 solution for now, having two separate data sets, but making sure the capacity factors are pretty close.
Yeah, thanks. That's super helpful and demonstrates the benefit of these MAG meetings when we actually get to have dialogue. So thank you for that. The process question I had is you listed on the last slide of this morning segment your next steps. And I wondered if any of those things that you're going to do are going to have any visibility to us, the stakeholders, or if you think that the next thing we'll see will really be a proposed decision out of the commission.
It's Nathan again. Good question. On a couple of these, it's still a little bit TBD. I know that that's an unsatisfying answer, but I'd kind of go towards your last statement there of expect to see a PD. So when you see like the third bullet, complete aggregation of all LSC IRP filings, that's the sort of thing that is currently in the scoping memo schedule as I think Q2, basically springtime, for you to start seeing at least the prelim version of that. So maybe not PD form, but at least like a ruling and then a workshop where you'd start to be able to consume not just aggregation results, but also the results of SERVM analysis using the new SERVM that Donald and Patrick have described. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for that. Appreciate all your work and the MAG session this morning.
Okay. Thanks, Ellen. I'll put you on mute. Ali, I still have 4 hands raised. Let me try Chase Winkler again. You're unmuted.
Hey guys, this is Kevin Card with Eshraghi Consulting. We are the vendor for SERVM. Chase and I are working on some work for the IOUs. We had a question about the wind profiles. The wind profiles that I believe these are the same ones that Donald posted in July on the CPUC website. Can you confirm that?
Yep. Yes.
Okay. Do you have any documentation
Well, these are the ones that we reposted earlier this year, probably in July. Like we posted some stuff in 2019, but then we reposted these earlier in 2020.
Okay. Yeah, my expectation, they're the latest ones that are posted on the website right now. This has got a July date on it, just confirming. We've done some review of the wind profiles. I'm just curious if you guys have any documentation of any calibration that was done with those profiles. One of the things that we've seen in that data set, I'm curious about, is kind of the timing of the shape. So if I look at the seasonal shapes during the summer, it shows the minimum output of the wind profiles in like hours 16, 17, 18. When we compare the historical wind profiles that we pull from CAISO's website or other places, it looks like the minimum output in the summer for wind is in like the hours 12 and 13 instead. I'm just curious, there may be some data alignment issues that we've got on our end, or if you guys have any documentation on kind of how those shapes were calibrated ultimately.
We'll see what we can find. We probably have some documentation, and we'll talk to you about it.
Okay, sounds great.
Thank you. I think just doing a quick time check here, we have still a lot to cover. I think we need to move on to the next section. We can have a Q&A about like this section at the end of the presentation if time allows, but let's move on to the section number 3. Just as a reminder, if you ask your questions, please lower your hand so we can know ask question or not. Thank you.
Okay. Hello, Ali. Can you hear me?
Yes, Jimmy.
All
Thank
right.
you.
Great. So I'm Jimmy Nelson from E3. I'm going to walk you through a comparison that we performed between historical emissions from the CAISO system in the year 2019 and modeled emissions from the Resolve and SERVM models for the year 2020. And thanks to my staff who helped me work on this, Xiaoxuan, Yuchi, Charlie, Aaron, and Arnie. Go on. Next slide. Okay, so, sorry, I'm having connectivity issues here. I will attempt to work through them. So the genesis of this analysis was that we looked at the historical emissions from 2019 from CAISO and saw they were, around 49 million metric tons. And then we looked at the model results from Resolve and SERVM, and they were around 37 or 36 million metric tons. So that's 12 or 13 million metric tons of difference between the two. And that brings up the question, why is there that difference? And are there things that we should be fixing in the models to better match reality? The analysis is, we go into a lot of detail, but at the same time, it is relatively high level. We are not performing production simulation runs to try and get at these differences. We're using a more simplified method, which I will go into. You may remember from 2 years ago, we performed a similar analysis comparing CAISO 2017 actual emissions to Resolve 2018 emissions. You may want to look back at that at your leisure. I have the link on the page, and you will see at the end we had some recommendations at that point for updates, and we have implemented a number of those recommendations. Next slide. Ali, can you confirm that you can hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Jim. Yeah.
Okay, great. My phone is still going. My internet has.
Yes, we don't have your video, but we have your audio.
Okay, well, I can keep going. I have the slides here.
Thank you.
So to set you up kind of in the right mindset, we have to remember that CAISO actual dispatch is immensely complicated. CAISO does 5-minute nodal simulations with every transmission node and transmission line, multiple market clearing timeframes, an EIM market, et cetera, et cetera. It's immensely complicated, and there's no real good way to simulate that grid in detail, in all of the detail that you could imagine. Production simulations pretty much always make a number of simplifications. They usually don't really treat market participant behavior in detail and self-scheduling. There can be issues with perfect and imperfect foresight. There are things that are specific to the way that actual years play out that you don't necessarily want to model in future years, namely, exactly when did a specific heat wave occur? Did you have a low or a high or a medium hydro year in a specific year? You might want to model more general conditions or a range of conditions when you simulate future years, and so on and so forth. So there's a number of reasons that production simulations are expected to diverge from reality, and you take that as a grain of salt in the comparison. And there's one actual category of differences that we put into this type of difference. So next slide, Ali. To take that analogy one step further, Resolve is a simplified production simulation model, or has a simplified production simulation model in its logic. The reason why we use a simplified one is because the focus of Resolve is to determine long-run capacity investments. And to do that, we know that you need to understand the economics of dispatch, but there's basically just a model runtime issue where you can't completely do an 8760 production simulation with all of the bells and whistles and also make informed investment decisions. So Resolve simplifies a number of things, including aggregating plant types. So, maybe 20 or 30 combined cycles become one big aggregated combined cycle. We linearize or partially linearize unit commitment constraints, so there are no integer decisions in resolve. We reduce the number of days down to about 37 representative days, so that's a factor of 10 reduction in the number of days we have to simulate. And there are a number of other simplifications. So you would expect at least a little bit of divergence between resolve and production simulations, and then kind of by extension between resolve and actual dispatch. So part of the point of this analysis is to ask the question, how big is that difference? Is it really big or is it really small? And we're focusing here on greenhouse gas emissions. That's the point of the analysis, to determine, are we getting greenhouse gas emissions right? And then kind of downstream of that, are there any reasons why the emissions are off, and should that imply different things about what we should do about dispatch? Next slide, Ali, it should show comparison methodology. Is it on that
Yes.
slide?
Yes.
Sorry, I still can't see. Apologies.
No worries.
Okay, so we use 2019 CAISO greenhouse gas emission and megawatt hour production settlement data. That data was provided by CAISO, and we compare that data to Resolve and SERVM 2020 data. So as I said before, we're not comparing the same years. So there's already one kind of one difference that is going to make some meaningful impact in our comparison. We E3 went and categorized as apples to apples as we could all the different technology classes in the Resolve, SERVM, and CAISO data sets into the ones you see on the right. There should be no surprises here: combined cycles, peakers, coal, hydro, nuclear, etc. And we quantified the megawatt hours that each of those classes generated. And also we looked and saw the emission rate, the ton CO2 per megawatt hour of those generators. You combine those two factors, multiply emission rate by generation, and you get the tons CO2 for each of these technology classes. Then you have to ask yourself, well, you see a difference in ton CO2. Why does that difference exist? And more specifically, what would have happened to close that difference, to shrink that difference or eliminate it? So for this, we assume what we call a counterfactual, where we say there's one specific thing that would be adjusted to bring the data sets more in line. And we recognize that this is this is an imprecise method. Anyone who's familiar with production simulation knows that if you change one
You're on mute. We got your video back, but you're on mute.
Okay, thank you. So I think the assumption of a counterfactual is a simplifying assumption that we know is not perfect, but lets us do, lets us look at a lot of different differences between the data sets relatively quickly. Next slide. So if you're wondering how this counterfactual assumption plays out, let's take a relatively simple example. So one example that I think is pretty easy to understand is we're simulating 2020 in Resolve and SERVM. There are some generators that are simply just not online in CAISO 2019 actual operations that we're simulating in 2020. There were some generators that were built in 2019. There were some generators that are projected to have been built in 2020. So we don't expect that generation to match. And if you quantify the difference, you get 7 terawatt hours of expected unmatching generation. So what's the counterfactual? Building on kind of our experience with production simulations, usually when you crank up the level of renewable generation, dispatchable resources in CAISO, dispatchable gas turns down. So let's say that 7 terawatt hours of dispatchable gas turns down. We turn down a ratio of combined cycles and peakers, roughly 90% combined cycles and 10% peaker, to reflect the fact that sometimes combined cycles are on the margin, sometimes peakers are. And yeah, on the right-hand most panel, you can see that you multiply the difference in generation by the difference in emission factor, and you get that the 7 terawatt hours of generation turns out to be about 3 million metric tons of emissions. Next slide. Because we examined a lot of different categories of differences, we bucketed those categories to kind of try and help the explanation along. The first category is expected differences. We know that because 2019 is different than 2020, and 2019 is a specific year, and 2020, when we model it, is kind of more of an aggregation of many different conditions. We just expect that there to be some differences in load and renewable production and hydro. So, you know, we know that's the first category. The second category is basically we identified 2 ways in which the CAISO and modeled SERVM and resolve numbers are not apples to apples in the way that the greenhouse gases are counted. So we'll highlight those. The third category is really kind of, in some ways, the point of the comparison, things that we found that we think should be updated. And the fourth one is any remaining differences that can be attributed to greenhouse gas emitting resources, which are kind of the slack resources that pick up any differences. So Ali, why don't we stop here and take a couple of questions, but I would ask folks on the webinar to maybe, you know, we're going to show a lot of result slides in just a minute. So maybe hold those questions for later and just ask questions about kind of framing and purpose and whatever else isn't necessarily related to specific results.
Sure. I see some hand raised, but it seems that they are from like the previous section. If you have any questions for this section that Jimmy went through, please raise your hand.
Let me unmute Amy Lee. It may be an old question, but go ahead, Amy.
Hello, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Great, thank you. Yeah, this is Amy from Southern California, Edison. Yeah, actually, I have a question for the previous session, but I think it's related to this session. Basically, the first one is in the previous session when you guys putting together the comparison of the annual energy from different resources, we do notice that there's a significant differences between the import assumption reported from resolve and the SERVM. For example, for the 46 MMD case, for the unspecified import, the SERVM, the dispatched number was about like 13,000 gigawatt hour lower than the resolve. But going to the 38 MMT case, the 2 number moving to the same direction has a lower import. And since the specified import has a big impact on the GHG emission, so I would like to hear your opinion about why, what's the differences between these 2 models, and do you guys trying to find the differences and align the assumption with each other? And the second one I would like to ask is about the pumped storage. Do you guys have a little bit more detailed information about the dispatch pattern of the pumped storage? Is the 12-hour pump storage was fully utilized in the SERVM dispatch or not? Thank you.
Right. Thanks for that. I can address some of the unspecified import questions. We will, in subsequent slides, go into the 2020 implications of differences in unspecified imports between historical and SERVM and historical and resolve. I always think of unspecified imports as one of the 3 large sources of somewhat dispatchable generation that it could be on the margin. Unspecified imports have a slightly higher emission rate than combined cycles, but we've seen the balance between unspecified imports and in CAISO generation be pretty sensitive to modeling assumptions. but because the emission rate is only slightly higher for unspecified imports, it tends to make even big differences in megawatt hours of unspecified imports tend to make relatively small differences in greenhouse gas emissions and I think, you know, production costs in general. So I'll leave it there.
Okay, thanks, Amy. Ali?
David, quick housekeeping, actually. If we're going to maybe have a persistent problem with folks' hands kind of accidentally being left up and us not being able to distinguish whether it's a fresh question or an old one, what might actually be useful is if your hand's still up for a question in a section that's been passed, if you could actually just chat it using the chat function in the lower right to Ali Eshraghi. He'll track them. We'll seek to answer them at the end of the MAG. And if we can't get to them in the MAG, we'll seek to answer them through some other means, perhaps by posting answers on our website. Sorry about the inconvenience, but we do have to keep the timeline moving.
Yeah, and speaking to that, Ali, I don't know how many more questions you have, but it would probably make sense for me to get through the rest of my material pretty soon so we can leave that at the end.
I don't see any other hand raised for this section. I think we can move on.
Okay, let's move on. Okay, so the main section of this analysis is going to be looking at differences between CAISO 2019, actual, and Resolve 2020. I will, spoiler alert, because Resolve and SERVM did a pretty big calibration exercise last summer, the differences that you see here are going to largely apply to SERVM as well. So if you see a difference between CAISO and Resolve, most of those differences are also present when you compare CAISO to SERVM. I will breeze over the SERVM comparison slides at the end, not because they aren't important, but because they show more or less the same thing as the CAISO to Resolve comparison. Next slide. So here is kind of the punchline in complicated waterfall form. So I will explain this slide using the next few slides. So if it's kind of a lot to look at, you will get detailed explanations. Let's start on the left. CAISO 2019 total. The 49.3 million metric ton emission value is the emissions reported by CAISO for 2019. So that's the left. On the right are the Resolve emissions that we report for 2020, 37.6. You can see that there's a big difference between them, and all of the different categories in the middle tell you where the difference comes from. So the first thing you can see is just there isn't one factor that explains it all. There's not just one big difference that if you fix that, you would bring the data sets fully in line. There's a number of small things and some medium-sized things, but no huge things. And some of the categories are actually really small. The ones that are small we include because they are potential sources of difference that we found that were, we found them to actually be small when we looked at the numbers. As I mentioned a couple slides ago, there are 4 categories of differences. Expected differences, so these things are things that we think would change year on year. Accounting methodology, where we're not comparing exactly apples to apples between the way that CAISO and Resolve report emissions. Recommended updates, things that we think should probably be addressed in the modeling. And then the slack variable, greenhouse gas emitting dispatch. So I'm going to go through these 4 categories now. Next slide. Oh, actually, sorry, Ali, can you go to the previous slide? One color coding thing here, blue items are, when we looked at the difference, blue ones are ones that appear to bring the data sets more in line. In other words, if you adjust for new wind and solar generation, you bring the data sets more in line. The 2 red ones actually bring the data sets slightly less in line. So that's why they kind of go up and down and up and down. So next slide. There's a lot of text here. Some of this is meant for your review after this call. You know, these slides are going to live on the PUC website, and so you can refer to them later. But each of these boxes explains certain parts of the waterfall. The one that you are familiar with, because I just went through it, is the first box, the expected wind and solar generation difference of 7 terawatt hours, which equates to 3 million metric tons of difference. So that's the example I ran through before. The next one is nuclear. We observed that there was a Diablo Canyon outage in late 2019 that was likely not representative of the long run average. So that creates a small difference in emissions because there's less greenhouse gas free generation than we modeled in Resolve. We think it's probably not material and expect Diablo to be up and running smoothly in the future. Actual demand was in 2019 was 5 terawatt hours lower. So if demand would have been higher in 2019, the emissions would have been higher as well, which is why this is a red box that pushes the emissions in the opposite direction, that it pushes them further away for the data sets instead of closer. Hydro generation, we combined together hydro imports and in CAISO hydro generation, and there's a little bit of heterogeneity there and a little bit of difference between the data sets, but in general, the hydro that was observed in 2019 produces, roughly the same amount of gigawatt hours and emissions as we observe or as we model in 2020. Next slide. Accounting methodology. This one, it's worth thinking about this a little bit. Let's go to the left one first. 1 million metric tons of difference are attributable to different combined heat and power emission rates. The emission rate that you use for combined heat and power is always challenging because you're putting fuel into a combined heat and power plant, and that's easy to quantify. But then part of the useful output of that fuel is going to an industrial process or heating a building or steam, and part of it's going to electricity generation. And it is arbitrary the way that you parse out that fuel. And so, therefore the emissions in some sense are arbitrary. CARB does have a way to account for this, and we appear to be using slightly different accounting methods in Resolve and SERVM than is used in the CAISO data set. So it's a relatively small difference, but it accounts for 1 million metric tons or so of emissions. The other difference, which is larger, is that the CAISO emissions inventory includes emissions from biomass, biogas, and geothermal. There's certainly no question that that biomass plants emit carbon out of their stack because they're combusting plants and other organic material. But Resolve and SERVM are covering kind of the scope of CARB's cap and trade program, which does not include those emissions as covered under cap and trade. And so we're really just looking at a different scope here. We all understand that these plants emit carbon, but we're just, it's a different scope. So the recommendation here is pretty simple. Just, I think in the future we can report things in Resolve and SERVM both ways. We can give biomass an emission factor and geothermal and biogas, but not necessarily include those emissions under the greenhouse gas cap. So, if you did that, that would explain away just about 4 million metric tons of the delta between the two. Next slide. As I said before, a lot of the point of this exercise is to identify things that we think are candidates for improvement. We noticed that biomass and geothermal, as modeled in Resolve and SERVM, have higher capacity factors than they did in CAISO historical operations. So the recommendation here is to update the capacity factor and energy production from biomass and geothermal to match historical. And then One other thing that was already highlighted by Patrick in the SERVM presentation prior to this one is that we identified some wind and solar resources that appear to be redundant or erroneous. And that was providing too much solar generation and wind generation in Resolve and SERVM. And so the recommendation is to remove those. We have specific resources that we have recommended to remove. And if you did so, you would see a roughly 2.3 million metric ton increase in emissions from Resolve or SERVM, plus or minus. Next slide. Let's look at imports here. The greenhouse gas intensive imports include unspecified imports. This is getting to Amy's question before. CAISO 2019 had roughly a quarter more unspecified imports than Resolve in 2020. But if you think about what happens when you try to when you compare the Resolve level of unspecified imports to the CAISO, we're saying that to a first approximation, unspecified imports can be substituted with in-CAISO dispatchable gas. So the question is really, what is the emission factor difference between those two? And it ends up being pretty small. Unspecified imports are around 0.43 tons per megawatt hour, and dispatchable CAISO gas is maybe on the order of 0.4. So even though there's a meaningful difference between the megawatt hours of unspecified imports, it doesn't necessarily translate into a big greenhouse gas emissions difference. The other thing to note is that we do model specified coal imports in Resolve and SERVM, and we noticed a small difference in the megawatt hours of generation there, I guess roughly 1 terawatt hour. It's unclear how important of a priority this is. Coal is scheduled to not be imported into California, into CAISO, starting in the mid-2020s. And so any fix that we do here would not really affect the long-run picture, would only affect the short-run emissions. Next slide. And the last kind of final category, which I think could cause some confusion, and I'm happy to answer questions on, is, let's imagine we've accounted for all of the other differences on the waterfall. We've adjusted for existing wind and solar capacities and capacity factors, accounting differences, biomass generation, coal generation, unspecified imports, all of those. We've done everything on the waterfall except for the, just bringing the amount of dispatchable gas in line between the two data sets. Basically, the question that we're asking with the last category of in-CAISO gas dispatches, what's left after all of that? If you had exactly the same amount of renewable generation, if you had the same emission rate for different technologies, what would be left as an emissions difference? And the answer is a small amount of greenhouse gas emissions, 0.4 million metric tons. So I'll go into it on the next slide, but this speaks to some of the improvements that we've made largely behind the scenes in the modeling, because in the 2018 version of this analysis, we identified a 3.5 million metric ton difference that would have been in this category. So we've gone from 3.5 million metric tons, which is pretty big, to 0.4, which is pretty small. I will note, things are not perfect. It is a persistent challenge to make production simulation models dispatch, especially flexible gas peakers at the same level that we observe in CAISO actual. So there is a difference in gas peaker dispatch between the two data sets. But once again, the difference between a peaker and a combined cycle emission rate is not that big. It's a little, but it's not a lot. And so a kind of medium-sized difference in gas peaker dispatch does not translate into a medium-sized difference in greenhouse gas emissions. So I think the recommendation here is pretty high level. Try even more steps to increase the gas peaker dispatch knowing that it will only have a moderate impact on greenhouse gas emissions. Next slide. This is another one of these slides that I'm hoping you can look at after this presentation to digest all of the text. Here we have a list of all of the updates that we suggested in the 2018 comparison and kind of a status update. Did we actually do the thing that we suggested? And if so, what impact do we think it had? We did include fuel consumption when starting combined cycles and peakers. That may be one of the reasons why emissions are more in line for gas plants in this round. We did not do a deep dive on the resources providing reserves. I think that was mostly just a timing issue. We may revisit that in the future, though with batteries coming online, that becomes maybe less of an important issue. We did add or specified coal imports, which shrunk the difference that we see between actual and modeled for coal. We partially modeled some of the CHP fleet as dispatchable. It isn't actually dispatchable in Resolve, but we do vary the capacity factor by month, so that does provide a profile to the energy. We compared the historical and modeled renewable capacity factors and found, and updated those capacity factors for existing plants and found that really there's not much difference from that specific category in the 2020 results. We update the demand forecast every year to the new IPR, and we did update the combined cycle heat rate and emission factors using the CAISO master file, and that basically eliminated almost 2 million metric tons of emissions difference we saw in the previous round. So, Ali, why don't I actually go through the SERVM slides quickly? I think that's the easiest way. So let's go 2 slides ahead. We're going to the similar analysis for SERVM. So now we're comparing the same CAISO data set, CAISO 2019, to SERVM simulation of the year 2020. Important thing to note, Patrick's presentation showed a progression of SERVM updates. Again, due to timing, we weren't able to catch the data from the last update that included the battery dispatch update and the combined cycle commitment update. So this waterfall does include the wind shape update, but does not include the subsequent SERVM modeling improvements. Apologies for that, but that is, that is what it is. So the main thing to take away from this slide is that it looks largely like the Resolve emissions waterfall. You can kind of, after this meeting, you can go back and forth between the two, but you'll see that they are mostly the same. Next slide. So, this is I guess this is attributable to a lot of the work we did last summer in 2019, I guess, summer, where we tried to align Resolve and SERVM on many different greenhouse gas and production level variables. And there are a few differences between the data sets, namely nuclear, hydro, gas fleet dispatch, but they're all on the order of or smaller than 1 million metric tons, which is roughly the threshold at which we can say that the data sets are mostly aligned. But I think the process of going back and forth between these two models is one that's never really finished. So I think we're up for suggestions of ways to sync them better, and if they start to get out of alignment, we will work to get them back in alignment. And final slide. So, I've gone through kind of expected changes that you might see from year to year, adjusted the gas generation for that, adjusted for accounting methodology differences in zero greenhouse gas emitting resources like biomass and geothermal and wind, And then when you do all of that, as I mentioned before, the kind of leftover amount of gas plant dispatch differences are relatively small, on the order of 1 million metric tons. The near-term actions we see as a result of this analysis are the same ones that are on the recommended differences slide, namely reduce energy production from existing geothermal and biomass facilities to reflect recent historical capacity factors, and then remove some wind and solar power plants from the baseline resource data set. And both of those updates would reduce the amount of greenhouse gas-free generation available to the models, and just as the first order effect would increase emissions. Now, I think we have yet to see how this would play out in Resolve, because if you increase emissions but then start to hit an emissions cap, you may require additional greenhouse gas-free resources to replace them. But I think it's kind of speculation at this point, and I don't think we're going to talk more about the future implications of this in this mag. So thanks for listening to this kind of in-depth comparison, and I think we have about 20 minutes, so please ask some questions.
Here I see Pushkar, you're unmuted.
Hi, good morning. This is Pushkar Wagli from Clean Resource Consultants. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. I believe this benchmarking / comparison exercise has been very helpful, and Jimmy, you did a great job at presenting it. I do have a question for Nathan as I was going through it, and the question is, do you plan to provide the details of this exercise to CAISO? And I'm especially looking at the energy production from existing wind and solar resources, because it's pretty clear that in Resolve and SERVM, and that issue might also be part of the CAISO production cost modeling, where they also may have higher amounts for those existing wind and solar resource generation than that was probably observed historically. And CAISO also may consider updating its own production cost modeling, as, for example, as part of their transmission planning process exercise, because if they have the same issue, they would be clearly also overestimating renewable curtailments or congestion. So the question is, would you be, we have some high level numbers here, but I'm sure they would be interested in more details of this exercise.
Pushkar, it's Nathan. Great point. We actually already have been coordinating with CAISO quite a bit on this analysis, just kind of writ large, but it seems you're pointing to more specific elements, particularly some shapes. Off the top of my head, I'm not certain the level of alignment between ours and theirs, but it's always an ongoing conversation. We do coordinate with them a lot on this topic and others, because we do see them as a partner in planning, if you will.
Great. Thank you for that response, Nathan. That's all I had.
Thanks, Pushkar. I don't see any other hands at this time.
Me neither. So
let's give folks a minute. That was a lot of content.
Yeah, I see one more.
Yeah, here's the phone. I think it's John. Go ahead. Call in user 19.
It's not unmuted.
Speaking of,
yeah, go ahead.
You can't hear me. Okay, you can hear me, correct?
Yes.
Yes.
Great. Okay. So yes, Jan Gligier from PG&E. So speaking of shapes, I was well. The modeling analysis and comparison so far have all been on sort of annual numbers. You did mention shifting GHG output around between the months, but there was no real discussion of what hourly energy price shapes or ancillary service price shapes might look like. I know that we are familiar with the general impression that production simulation models tend to have price shapes that are a little too flat, and they don't have enough differentiation between the peak and the middle of the day, the peak off peak, and that's been brought up in a couple of proceedings already. Anyway, we think it'd be really important to look at that issue here. I'm wondering whether you looked at it as part of this exercise. If so, whether you'll be sharing any results, and if not, whether you plan on looking at that in future.
Let's see, I'll start, and then maybe someone from the CPUC might want to add on, but we did not look at price shapes for this analysis, so yeah, we didn't do that. I agree that sometimes production simulations can be too flat on prices. But the next section, led by Xiaoxuan from E3, will give a comparison between CAISO 2019 dispatch on certain days and certain seasons and SERVM 2020 dispatch. So that's one part of the puzzle. It's not all of the parts, but it is one part.
Okay, thanks for the clarification.
And I will likewise add, this is Donald Brooks again. I think that this exercise here didn't specifically focus on the prices and price analysis, but I think there's other places where that could be really useful, and I think it's important to do that analysis. So we're considering and thinking about where we could start to really look at the price shapes produced and see if we can do a little more study of those.
Okay, Deborah, you're unmuted.
Hi, this is Deborah Bayless representing CAISO. First of all, thank you so much for the presentation and analysis. I have a couple of quick questions. The first one is, I'm wondering if you also looked at differences in criteria pollutant emissions that result from the change in dispatch between peakers and the CCG, the combined cycle units, because the emission profiles are different. Cycling emissions are generally higher in the combined cycle.
We did not for this analysis.
And then my second question is you've looked at the differences between the 2020 emissions, and I'm wondering if you would expect that the same issues would persist in the 2030 projections. So in other words, would you anticipate that it would be the same magnitude of greenhouse gas emission difference in 2030 for the resolve and SERVM results?
This is Nathan. Jimmy, I'd be curious about this. I'm a little hesitant to speculate, Deborah. I see where you're going with it, and I'm also, I would be curious, but I'm going to kind of go back to Donald's statement from the previous section of it's a little bit tough to know as the composition of the portfolio changes and dispatch of basically everything in it starts to change. I don't want to go out there and say definitively that it would say stay at the same magnitude or go in one direction or another. Jimmy, I don't know if you would add anything to that, but Deborah, maybe it's something to think about in terms of, are there ways that this analysis could be done differently in the future, say future cycles of IRP, to ground it in different things, or to maybe tell different, to, I guess, paint different parts of the picture in terms of time frame or goals. Does that make sense?
And it does make sense. And I think the analysis you did makes sense. The reason I'm asking is because, the IRP needs to meet the 2030 requirements. And so some type of translation into how these results impacts 2030 would be really helpful. I mean, we can speculate that some of the problems would persist, but I realize that the magnitudes might be slightly different.
Yeah, we appreciate that. Thank you for the feedback.
Thank you. I don't see any other questions at this point. If there is no more question, we can move on to the next section. And at the end, if time allows, we can have more Q&A regarding the first, second, and third section. So let's, Xiaoxuan, do you want to take it from here?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Ali. Yeah, I'm going to give a brief presentation on the SERVM dispatch data study that the E3 team did with the guidance from CPUC's IRP and energy resource modeling team. Next slide, please. So this was a high-level study of the SERVM production cost modeling. And our goal for the study was to take a closer look at SERVM's internal dispatch results and compare that to CAISO's actual dispatch and see if we can identify any issues and provide any recommendations. Our general conclusion was that the SERVM dispatch looks broadly reasonable across a range of conditions. We did note a few remaining questions for further investigation, and we will walk through those in the following slides. Before going into the details, I want to mention two caveats here. The first one is similar to the study that Jimmy just presented on. We were comparing CAISO's actual 2019 operation to SERVM's 2020 operation. So we're comparing 2 different years. SERVM's 2020 system has more resources and kind of different load. So we are not expecting the 2 sets of dispatch to look exactly the same. And the second caveat is that the study was pretty high level and we were just visualizing and comparing the dispatch plots. So our conclusions are mostly directional and qualitative. Next slide. We've constructed the study to answer 3 main questions listed here. The first 2 are basically just comparing SERVM's 2020 to CAISO's 2019, see if it's broadly realistic, and especially looking at SERVM's loss of load events and thinking if its treatment of the reliability resources during the loss of load event is reasonable. And that's critical because we're using SERVM as a reliability production cost model. And third question here has a focus on SERVM's 2030 dispatch. And the idea here is by 2030, the system will have a significant solar surplus and a lot more battery storage in the system. So we want to make sure that SERVM is behaving well in that world as well. We used SERVM's updated reference system plan runs for 2020 and 2030. So that would include the wind shape updates and also the SERVM client update that includes improvements in CCGT and battery operation algorithms as Patrick has presented on. So for our comparison, it already has a lot of the improvements that were identified earlier, and we were just trying to see if everything still makes sense and if we can catch more. Next slide, please. So going into the first question, we compared SERVM's monthly average dispatch to CAISO's monthly average dispatch and saw that the dispatch patterns from SERVM are broadly reasonable. We did note a question on SERVM's utility scale solar ship, and that will show up in the next slide. In addition to that, we noticed that for ramping needs, SERVM uses a slightly different combination of thermal resources than what CAISO uses. And Jimmy has alluded to this a little bit earlier. It's really hard for this kind of production cost model to exactly match the thermal unit commitment as what CAISO has, but we think the difference is within a reasonable range. Next slide. So this slide compares CAISO's April 2019 dispatch on the bottom right, bottom left to SERVM's April 2020 on the bottom right. So on the high level, looking at the 2 dispatch plots, they look pretty similar in terms of the general pattern. We did notice 2 kind of big differences here. The first one is just looking at the renewable generation on the SERVM side, especially the solar output colored in yellow. We're seeing a lot more solar output from SERVM, and that is because we're looking at SERVM's 2020, which just has a lot more solar capacity on the system. But in addition to that, we were also seeing that SERVM's solar shape is slightly different than what CAISO has, and we have flagged that as an area for further investigation. And the second difference on these two plots is the imports comparison, which is the pink area on top of both dispatch plots. So on the SERVM side, we're not seeing any midday imports, and imports ramps up during early evening hours to provide reliability need, whereas on the CAISO side, I think in reality, we were thinking CAISO would have a pretty similar dynamic, but that's not shown on this graph because we did not have CAISO's RA export data. So CAISO's imports data shown on the left is kind of gross imports before netting of exports, whereas the SERVM imports shown on the right represents the net imports. So the difference here is largely driven by an accounting difference rather than a fundamental difference. Next slide. This slide compares CAISO's September 2019 to SERVM's September 2020. And again, the general dispatch pattern looks pretty similar between the two. On the right, SERVM has a slightly steeper evening ramping. And we're seeing that SERVM uses a combination of CCGT, the darker gray area, steam turbine and combustion turbine, and also some battery storage to provide the evening ramping need. Whereas on the CAISO side on the left, we're seeing the evening ramping is mostly met by combustion turbine and a little bit of CCGT. And another difference on this graph is, again, SERVM shows a lot more battery dispatch than what CAISO has, and this is driven by comparing two different years. SERVM's 2020 just has more battery capacity. Next slide. So we've been comparing monthly average dispatch so far, and this slide compares a particular type of day. This is looking at two specific days that have high curtailment and ramping from the CAISO data and the SERVM data. The reason we wanted to look at this is because this is a type of condition that will be a lot more prevalent going into the future. And we thought it's interesting to make sure that SERVM is behaving well in this kind of situations. And again, similar story, the 2 days dispatch pattern look pretty similar. Starting from the middle of the day, in both plots, we're seeing significant renewable generation pushing down thermal output, which are clustered at the bottom of the plots. In the CAISO graph, it's probably hard to see, but CAISO maintains some amount of CCGT online during the middle of the day, likely to provide operating reserves. Whereas if you look into the SERVM dispatch, CCGT is pushed down to close to zero during the midday hours, and that's likely because SERVM can use batteries to provide some operating reserves. Moving to the evening ramping hours, this is again, we've mentioned this earlier, the two system kind of uses a slightly different combination of resources for evening ramping. In CAISO, you're seeing CCGT ramping up, combustion turbine ramping up, whereas on the SERVM plot, it's really a combination of CCGT, a little bit of hydro, and some battery storage dispatch. Next slide. Now going into the second question, kind of zooming into the loss of load events, we saw that during the loss of load events, SERVM is fully utilizing the available reliability resources. There is a little exception for the resources used to provide operating reserves, but other than that, we're seeing most resources are being used. Next slide. So this slide shows a summer peak day in SERVM's 2020 dispatch. And looking at the dispatch plot from hours 17 to 19, we're seeing a little gap between the solid black line and the dispatch area, and that's showing some loss of load during these hours. And kind of zooming into different types of resources, starting from the thermal at the bottom. During this event window, we're seeing that all the thermal resources are dispatched to maximum capacity, except for the ones listed on the table in the bottom right. These are the thermal resources that are operated below max capacity, and the total undispatched megawatts is about 1.4 gigawatts, which is within a reasonable bound given what the operating reserves the system will need. And then moving up a little to the imports, we did see that SERVM is fully utilizing the 5 gigawatts of firming import capability during the loss of load event. That's what the SERVM model allows the CAISO system to rely on import for capacity. And finally, looking at the darker pink area below the imports area, that is showing SERVM trying to dispatch demand response to meet reliability as well. So overall, it's pretty fully using all the available resources that it has to meet the reliability need. Next slide. This slide fast forwards to year 2030. Similarly, we're looking at a loss of load event day on the bottom left. The reason we want to look into 2030 is because this is when battery storage will start to play a critical role to provide reliability. We want to see how storage performs. So starting from, if you look into the evening hours, especially the loss of load hours, starting from the darker purple area right below the imports area, that's showing pump storage discharging at its maximum capacity. And then below that, you have a greater purple area representing outputs from battery storage. We're seeing battery storage discharging ramps up in the earlier evening hours to provide the capacity need. But then this kind of output cannot sustain throughout the loss of load event due to the limited energy stored in those battery resources. We were also seeing that the maximum battery discharge level is a little bit below the total battery capacity. And there could be multiple reasons for that. One could be maybe some of the battery capacity is withheld to provide operating reserves, or it's also possible that the battery resources needs to discharge over a longer period than its duration. So it's those are our hypotheses. We did not kind of fully investigate what's exactly happening there, especially with what batteries are doing with providing reserves. So we flag that area as a question for further investigation. But in general, the kind of the battery output here still looks largely reasonable. And finally, we do not see as significant demand response output on this date compared to the 2020 graph. And it's likely because demand response are being dispatched pretty often in the earlier month. Therefore, the resource does not have as much availability when it comes into September in year 2030. This is, again, an area we did not kind of fully investigate and confirm. So we also flag that as a question for further investigation. Next slide. Now, moving on to our final question, We looked into SERVM's 2030 dispatch and found that especially with significant solar surplus and higher levels of battery storage, SERVM's internal dispatch logic looks generally reasonable. Next slide, please. So this slide shows SERVM's 2030 dispatch, again, showing April and September. The September dispatch plot on the right looks pretty similar to the reliability graph we just looked at. So I will focus on the left, which is showing SERVM's 2030 April dispatch. This is when the system enters into a world where you have a lot of renewable oversupply, especially during the middle of the day. And you're seeing thermal generation getting pushed down to minimum. And looking at the area between the solid black line and the dashed line, that is the area where you have battery storage charging from the renewable oversupply. And then the area between the dashed line and the dotted line is the area showing that the CAISO system is exporting a significant amount of renewable generation. And the area on top of the dotted area, the dotted line is basically showing that this is when you will have a significant amount of curtailment driven by the abundance of solar generation. Next slide, please. So with that, we have concluded that SERVM's dispatch generally looks reasonable across a broad range of conditions. This slide just recaps all the questions that we have identified for further investigation. That include SERVM's utility solar profile, some closer look into the battery storage operation, and demand response dispatch. Yeah, so that is the end of this presentation, and we're happy to take any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Xiaoxuan. So any questions regarding SERVM dispatch data say that Xiaoxuan just presented?
Ali, I don't see any hands raised at this time.
Yeah, I don't see any, but just maybe giving a minute, maybe people are still digesting the information. So
I think I see a hand raised from Carmack, I think.
Matt, go ahead.
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. So one question I had really ties together something that was brought up in the first part of the presentation with this last part of the presentation. I was just wondering if somebody could describe the changes to SERVM or the changes to inputs to SERVM that make combined cycles more flexible. And I'm wondering, given that you're already having a hard time sort of matching the mix of dispatch between combustion turbines and combined cycles that's observed in reality, whether this modeling change is actually sort of making that calibration even more difficult.
Well, this is Donald from Energy Division, and I wanted to say that I don't think we changed any inputs related to combined cycle or combustion turbine operation. It was the functionality in the model that changed so that the plants operated differently. As I understand it, the change resulted in ability of combined cycles to operate more flexibly, which I think you'll see in the ability of SERVM to get combined cycles down near their minimum. And it's the ability of storage to provide ancillary services, some constraints on the usage of storage to provide ancillary services only to its existing state of charge. So no inputs were changed. The thing with so now I think we're at least confident or more confident that the operation of the power plants in SERVM is more similar to what's seen in Resolve. I think Xiaoxuan was identifying some ways that actual real CAISO operations of those facilities might diverge, but I think the calibration between SERVM and Resolve is a little closer now that we've made the operational change in the new SERVM client to dispatch the power plants differently. Like I said, there's been no difference in the inputs that went in.
Hey, Donald, I don't want to belabor this point, but is there going to be some documentation of, sort of the change to SERVM that made combined cycles more flexible?
We'll go and see about documenting that a little more fully. We have just put some really brief notes in these slides. We'll need to, I guess, go and document that a little better.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Matt. Samuel Worley, go ahead. Samuel?
Can you hear me? Yes. Yeah, calling in from SDG&E, energy analyst here. And so just a question for Xiaoxuan. Great little presentation, but on slide 53, you kind of have, there is extra curtailment that we're seeing in the SERVM dispatch in April 2030. Do you think that in your recommendations in the next slide, you said to kind of work on this battery storage, capability and in implementing that? Do you think that extra storage and your kind of extra research and recommendations to look into that, do you think that'll help this issue of curtailment in 2030?
Yep, thanks, Samuel. Maybe I wasn't, apologize, maybe I wasn't clear enough. I think our recommendation on the battery storage side is more, maybe a step before what you're proposing. Our idea was just to confirm how is storage being dispatched, how are the decisions being made, if there are any idling capacity not being fully utilized. And I think we will need to figure out that first. And if we do see that kind of situation, that after that, we will be able to come to your question of, well, maybe improving battery storage will help soak up that curtailment. But at this point, I think we just don't know yet. That's a good question, and that is the direction we should probably think a little bit more that just given that the system will have more and more batteries in the future.
Yeah, thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Yep.
Thank you.
I'll add here that pretty much every modeling result I've seen in the 2030 timeframe for California ends up having a lot of curtailment in the spring. It ends up being not economical to install batteries to soak up all of the curtailment. So there's certainly a balance there. There could be more, there could be less, but I think the answer is still going to be much greater than 0 in the spring months.
Yeah, thanks, Jimmy.
Rebecca Simonson, go ahead.
Hi, yeah, I was just wondering if there has been any sensitivity analysis between 2020 and 2030 on any battery storage resources that may be subject to ITC charging restrictions for the first 5 years.
Let's see, so I'll start, I guess. So neither of the models that we're showing here, Resolve or SERVM, includes those charging constraints. You know, we model solar at a system level and storage at a system level. I think part of the reason for those constraints can be technically complicated to implement in the model. And I wonder how much the answer would change. It's possible that it might change some, but that's may be one of the reasons. It seems like if you look at the behavior here, the storage is charging in the early morning hours and then discharging in the early evening hours. And that's, I guess, kind of how I would expect a ITC paired battery to perform, but I'm sure there's some subtleties with reserves and other things that could cause them to diverge. I don't know. Anyone else on the team have some thoughts?
This is Donald. I don't have anything to add.
Hey, this is Nathan. I didn't realize that I was on mute. Thanks for your response, Jimmy, and thanks for the question, Rebecca. I don't really have anything else to add from a technical perspective. My question back to you would be more of kind of a policy one. Have you already, or would you plan on maybe in the future, kind of providing us either formal or informal recommendation on representation? To Jimmy's point, or representation of that constraint or set of constraints. To Jimmy's point, we've thought about it. It's a little fuzzy to us if there's kind of a material difference, but if there's a difference in opinion on that out there, we'd love to know. So feel free to follow up with us offline if you want.
Great, thank you. And I think that was my question, is whether that would be a material difference or not. So I'll follow up as needed. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Amy. Amy Liu, go ahead.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. This is Amy from SE. So we do have a general question about the optimization window in the servant. So we would like to know, is the optimization window in the servant is daily or hourly? Thank you.
Donna, do you want to?
Yeah, it's doing dispatch every hour.
Yeah, we understand it's doing dispatch for every hour, but want to know a little bit more. So for the optimization, do they find to minimize the cost on hourly basis or on daily basis? Thank you.
I believe it's on an hourly basis, but now that you've asked, you've got me thinking, and so I'm going to go back and circle back with staff to make sure that I'm right about that.
Great, thank you.
Chase Winkler.
Yeah. Hey, this is Kevin Card. We're the SERVM vendor again with Eshraghi Consulting. So just to that last question, wanted to confirm. So it's actually a weekly commitment window that we use for the optimization. So it looks over the entire week to perform the commitment. It does the dispatch on that entire week as well, but that's kind of a preliminary based on expectation of load, wind, and solar and so forth. So it is a weekly window that we use for the commitment. I did want to provide confirmation on a couple other points. One was the question of the utilization of storage during emergencies, during firm load shed, that the output of the batteries is likely to be lower because it is providing, some of the battery capacity is providing ancillary services. So that's likely what is going on. So just providing confirmation on that. That's all that I had.
Great, thank you for your answer.
Yep.
Joseph Yan.
Yes, can you hear me? And this
yes.
is, this is the Joseph Yan with Southern California Edison. And just to follow up with that question, because the servant is in 168 hours optimization window. It allowed the CCGTs stay on and for the other days, while the ISO is only in 24 hours optimization, and it may not be for only one day, may not be able to cover its startup cost. So that can explain why the servant shows more flexible of the CCGTs and versus the servant, because of the optimization windows allowed and the CCGT online more compared to the ISO and the day-ahead operations. And this is just a comment. Thank you.
Holly, I don't see anybody else. Any new hands?
I see, seems calling you 19 has a new question, but if you can unmute.
Yep, go ahead, calling user.
Thank you. Yes, this is Jan Griggier again from PG&E. I've done a lot of modeling, so I have a lot of questions. So this one is kind of related to what Matt Barmack from Calpine was bringing up around flexibility of CCGTs, and also my earlier comment about prices being too flat. I'm a little unclear how SERVM models reg down. Certainly the upward ancillary services are fairly easy to model, but reg down is its own animal. And so I'm wondering, A, whether reg down is really being modeled separately from reg up, and whether that might be one of the reasons why, at least in the early years, the combined cycles go basically all the way to zero in the model, whereas they don't in reality, they stay up. And indeed, quite a few of them are above PMIN, exactly to provide reg down. The other issue, I think, with combined cycles is that a lot of them have contracts that say basically you can't do more than a certain number of startups, and or you have to pay a lot more for maintenance if you do go above a certain limit. So it's not the startup cost per se, it's basically an additional operational maintenance cost that comes into play when you're doing a lot of startups and shutdowns. And I'm guessing that the SERVM runs may not have that in there, and therefore their combined cycles are doing way more startups than they should be economically. And that would also sort of contribute to prices. So if you comment on those two issues about reg down and increased VOM from the startups, I'd appreciate it. Thanks.
Well, I can imagine that your second concern regarding startup restrictions in contracts and in variable operation and maintenance, I can really imagine that. It seems reasonable that we haven't fully implemented any of the contractual limitations on the operations of the plant in our SERVM dispatch. That makes sense. That might be another constraint that we need to look at. I think I could figure out how to do it, but that's definitely something to look at. As far as reg down, I'm going to have to get back to you on that. I think I know how. Yeah, I will provide written documentation of how the reg down is working, unless Kevin or Chase want to speak up on that subject.
Am I still unmuted?
Yep, I hear you.
Okay, great. Yeah, I'll be happy to provide some comments on the reg down and commitment. So on the reg down, just confirm that. So the optimization does include reg down as one of the variables that it uses in the optimization. Generally, though, if you look at the commitment for the other variables that it's trying to optimize for, there's going to be some inherent reg down in the system in most hours, except for during curtailment hours. And to serve that reg down during curtailment hours, you just curtail more to provide that reg down. So it's a fairly straightforward problem that gets solved within the solution mechanism that we've got in the model. So it does always provide the reg down. So I wouldn't say that that would explain kind of the commitment questions on the combined cycle. Just to offer a little bit of flavor on what changes we made to the commitment to reflect more flexibility on the combined cycles. Inside the commitment window, we use a dynamic programming algorithm to determine our commitment. So part of that dynamic programming algorithm, it steps up the commitment. So it looks at incremental commitment decisions to kind of a base decision. Part of that decision analysis is whether or not it makes sense to turn off or to leave a unit online, and that may affect whether it's committed at all. When we performed a more rigorous actual dispatch of the system, we got a better estimate of what the total cost impact of that commitment decision was, and so it ended up making sense to turn that unit on and either leave it on or turn it off, and that ended up kind of increasing the utilization of combined cycles. Now, to Matt Barmac's comment about, well, if we model this additional flexibility, but we don't see it inherent in the actual system operations, does it make sense to incorporate that? That's a good observation. I think my take is that the model should be allowed to optimize initially, and then we should impose whatever kind of real world constraints or uncertainties that we see in order to kind of make it mimic the actual dispatch. So I don't want to artificially constrain it. What I prefer to do is have it model the system as optimally as possible, and then introduce whatever uncertainties or other system constraints that we think are present in the system to get it to match up more closely.
Thank you. I don't see any other questions. David, can we go 2 slides ahead? So now hand it to Nathan for some closing comments.
Sure. Thanks very much, Ali. The last, I guess, almost 2.5 hours was a lot of information. So we want to thank everyone for your participation and kind of going through all of this with us. The real driving force here is kind of twofold. But the first is transparency. We want as many eyes on the 2 big analytical tools that we use in IRP as possible, so that we can kind of accomplish the second goal of evolving our process and getting better. We want to, have the best planning process that we possibly can for all involved. And believe it or not, there's some of you who are on this call just to better understand what we do, perhaps to kind of point out things that may or may not comport with your understanding, but we strongly appreciate the feedback because it helps us improve. So we just wanted to say thank you very much for spending time with us. If there are further follow-up questions from those of you that have been speaking up, I think that you all do have contacts that are on this call, whether myself, Ali, Donald, or Patrick. We're happy to continue the conversation, but otherwise, as Ali mentioned at the top, we will be posting materials and a recording of this on our website so that people can access into perpetuity. But that's it for me, Ali.
Thank you, Nathan, and thanks to our presenters, and I want to thank you everyone attending today's webinar for your attention on this topic. I think with that, we can adjourn, and I wish you a good afternoon.